Stay hungry, stay foolish.
I'm here with Michael B. Horn. I said we'd follow up with a part two. Michael's kindly given us his time ahead of a board meeting, believe it or not. So, Michael, great to have you back, man.
Yeah, it's good to be back. We had so much fun the first time, so I'm excited for round two.
There's so much value in this book. I'm not going to keep saying that, but I wanted to do what you do in the book and keep coming back to the principles and the theory of disruptive innovation. You tell us about the clash of student-centric technologies versus monolithic technology. And I wanted to frame this, as I said, in disruptive innovation, because there's two lessons throughout this book, which I love the way you do that, because you say, in every organization, there are forces that shape and morph every new innovative proposal so that it fits the existing organization's own business model rather than fitting the market it was intended to serve. One way to understand these forces in education is to visualize how the legislative process works itself. I'd love if you'd start here.
Yeah, so this is one of the central pieces I think that people miss about disruptive innovation, because they focus so much on the technology and the thing rather than the importance of the model in which it's deployed. And the quick example I love to say is in the mid-2000s, I was at America Online. I got to work on AOL Pictures. Most of your audience probably has no idea what AOL Pictures was for this reason, which is that I helped construct the business plan, and within days of it coming out, marketing came to me and said, well, your plan would reach these people, but we don't have any campaigns that reach those people. But if you work with us and shift it, we won't kill it. And then finance came to me and said, you're promising margins like this and revenues of this. No way that'll work. But if you work with us, we can get it over the hurdle rate. So I changed my assumptions and all the plan. You get the idea, right? Every single department over a matter of several weeks continually came to me. And what ultimately came out of the process was an innovation that met the needs of AOL's existing business model, but not the customers for whom it was in fact intended. And so Google Photos or Instagram, whatever you want to say, right? Like way more popular than AOL, which was meeting the needs of the business, not the needs of the people for whom it was intended. And this happens in all organizations, is that you take a new technology, it's primitive by comparison to the old of what you're doing, and the organization's instinct is to try to cram it into the existing operating model, make it sort of compete with the existing, or it morphs it and twists it to fit the needs of the existing organization rather than this new need. So in education, just really briefly, we use computers to deliver one-size-fits-all learning, right? That what we talked about last week, like we're all going to move at the same pace, same day. We're going to use electronic whiteboards and still do lectures or whatever it might be, rather than, oh, gee, what people really need is that tutor-like experience and everyone moving at different pathways and paces. But if you cram it in the existing schooling model, it literally is just, it's wrenching for people to get it to the right point for which the innovation will have the most transformational impact, shall we say. And so that's in business, it's in schooling. I would argue it's to your point, it's in Congress, it's in the legislative process where, senator comes out with what they think is a great idea for a social problem. Every single senator has to have their say and attach their line to this and adjust that and so forth. So what comes out meets the needs of the overall legislative body, as opposed to perhaps the original constituency for which it was built. That's just the way organizations work. It's neither good nor bad. There's both in it. But if you want something transformational that's different from what the organization has historically done, you need to get out of the existing business model or organizational model to implement it.
I wanted to bring it back to something there. So you mentioned this about an example to give our audience to bring it to life a little bit was, I experienced this in media, for example. So bringing in digital sales, trying to introduce digital sales, and then the sales team see it as a threat, and then actually try to cram it into what they're selling and trying to get incentivized on it, but it doesn't make sense because it makes so little money. So then they give it away as free in order to sell their existing product. I'd love your thoughts on that, because that is it's a mental model, or it's a phenomenon that happens time and time again. And also another thing, if you wouldn't mind commenting on, was you in AOL there being sent to this person and that department, etc., because many of our audience are those people. And I think it's really important for them to know when they're stuck in that cycle, and perhaps some advice on what they should do.
Yeah, well, so I'll say on the latter first. Clay was fond of saying that people are not stupid. They do stupid things because of the organizations they're trapped in, right? You put someone in this smart organization, right, to the side with different incentives, they'll do quote unquote the right things. And so I think for people that are stuck where they're trying to innovate and each department is trying to come out to them and get them to shift what they're doing to meet the needs of the organization, that's where you need to go up a level or maybe a few and say, hey, we really need a separate process here if we're trying to do something disruptive, and have a separate team that has some freedom from the existing structure to be able to innovate and prioritize this. And we call it the tool of separation. You really need to be able to wield that to give the autonomy to rethink the business model itself. If you're one of those people that's the finance department of the marketing hammering down, right, the various things that are consigning it to look like the old, you need to just ask yourself, hey, is this for the interests of the existing organization, or is this an innovation that's trying to do something transformational? In which case, maybe, my advice to, the Michael of the world bringing me this business plan would be like, look, I've got to do this because this is what this organization needs with its overhead. And I'm not going to kill the existing organization. But what I'm seeing is you're introducing a plan. Fundamentally, it's not going to work inside of the shell. I think we need to figure out a way to create a different business model around it that's separate from our existing organization. And, this speaks to the larger piece that you're talking about in terms of what we see is just that need for autonomy and freedom. And this is in the media industry. You talked about Clark Gilbert, who did his doctoral research under Clay Christensen, has this amazing dissertation where he profiles exactly how this plays out in the newspaper industry. And what you see is exactly what you just described, which is those newspapers, which were most of them, that tried to do digital as within their existing organization, the salespeople didn't really push it. You couldn't charge as much initially, right? So it didn't make sense. It was sort of that add-on that you'd get just to juice the sales or whatever else. But it wasn't transformational. Whereas the one or two newspapers that he tracked that made it a transformational thing and a real growth engine, they treated it as a totally separate unit with its own sales force that had the freedom to prioritize this because they weren't selling print ads in the old, right? And so I think it's a really important lesson that in the short term, it may feel like we're putting a lot more overhead and more people on it. But that's because if we think this is the new wave of growth or the new wave that we want to be doing something in the long run, you need to build the organization and look, be patient for profit. Patient for growth, impatient for profit. So we're not overloading the organization too early with costs. But it may be far more expensive in the long run if you don't separate it out and put that team around it.
One of the things you mentioned there is typical, which is also, you mentioned finance, for example. So finance will come along and go, when will this be profitable? When's it going to show potential in the future? How much is it going to cost us? And there are always really loaded questions for people. And I thought we'd illustrate this because you use histories of Nypro, Merrill Lynch, RCA to illustrate this problem and show how a manager can solve it. And maybe we could honor Nypro's Gordon Langton, who passed away in March 2021, with the story of his transformation and his obstacles that he had to overcome.
I didn't realize he had passed away. Thanks for he and Nypro are a famous case study in Clay's class. And essentially, the quick part of the story is this was a plastic injection molding business, and they had several different plants. And they came up with this new technology that would enable far more precise molding at very small, precise specifications, shall we say. And the intent in Gordon's mind was that rather than being this sort of very custom, big shop, large order sizes, but not large volume, that they could use this technology to go much more aggressively into this new market of very small, precise, large volume orders. And yet when he looked at it, what he realized was all of the plants, in effect, implemented it most of them returned the machine, I should say. I think only 2, if I recall the case study correctly, actually adopted it. And when he looked at what they were doing with it, they were using it to sustain their existing model of large dollar sizes, but small batches of manufacturing, in essence, around battery cases. So much smaller, precise things. And that's how they had adapted the technology to meet the existing business model, as opposed to that for which it was originally intended. And ultimately, right, the solution was to use it in a new plant that had the freedom with its own sales force to take orders in line with what he had conceived the market possibilities could be for this new technology he had identified. And being able to do that, again, that's that separation, that autonomy from the existing incentives was so critical to being able to use it in the way that it was originally thought out.
Like one of the things I think is so useful, and why I love this book, is the knowledge, introducing new knowledge that people were unaware of helps them make the decisions. Like, for example, for when I was stuck in that loop of, like you were in AOL, trying to get the sales team to understand, I learned that education and bringing new information to the table was the way, not thinking they were idiots for not getting it.
Yeah.
That was a reflection on me, not them. And that empathy is so important, because people don't know what they don't know, and particularly when it's dealing with the future. But I thought we'd illustrate a little bit more with the great case study you talk about Sony here, about the TVs and the evolution of TVs, because that speaks to the changes in the ecosystem and the incentives in the ecosystem. For example, the TV repair people. This is a brilliant case study.
This is one of my favorites also. So RCA and Zenith in the 1940s, 50s, 60s were the dominant consumer electronics companies of the time. They made their products and they were powered by vacuum tubes, which were about the size of your fist. They blew out every once in a while and you'd have to repair them, but they enabled incredible technological marvels of the time. Floor-standing televisions, tabletop radios with pretty good fidelity and so forth. And in 1947, scientists out of Bell Laboratories invented the transistor, the first foray into solid-state electronics. And all of the companies, RCA, Zenith, and so forth, saw the transistor and they're like, this is exciting. It's more durable. It can enable power-hungry devices in smaller applications. It's not there yet, right? It's not as good as a vacuum tube. And aside, by the way, it's still not as good as a vacuum tube at the high end. Like in the military applications where they have very demanding power needs, you still need to use vacuum tubes. But they said if we take a license to it and we stick it in our labs and do it and just invest in R&D on it, we can make it performance competitive with the vacuum tubes. We'll just swap them out for our existing products. No one will know the difference and they'll be thrilled. So they did exactly that. They framed it essentially as a technology problem, did a lot of research and development on it. Adjusted for today's dollars, I think it's probably about $2 billion that they invested in perfecting it. But that performance hurdle was so high that you could never look at it and say, oh, yeah, we ought to go with the transistor instead of the vacuum tube. Meanwhile, obviously the world did transition and transform into consumer electronics powered by transistors as opposed to vacuum tubes. But it started in 1952 with the hearing aid. And this was an application that needed very little power, with the transistor that could handle very little power. And a vacuum tube had always been impractical, right, for the hearing aid. So it was perfect. And then 3 years later, Sony in Japan, that no one had heard of, and when they heard of them, they didn't think much of them, came out with this pocket transistor radio. Tinny, static lace, terrible audio quality, but they didn't sell it to people who were buying the tabletop radios from RCA and Zenith. They sold it instead to non-consumers. Those people who, as Clay used to fondly say, the low end of humanity, people today we call teenagers, who were delighted with this quote unquote crummy product because for them it was great. They had no radio yesterday. Now for just a few dollars, they could buy a radio, and it was portable. So they could drop it in their shirt pocket, run out of earshot of their parents, and listen to the burgeoning rock and roll music they were getting excited about. And it got better and better. In 1959, Sony introduces a small black and white television. Not as good as the large floor standing TVs, from RCA, but for people with small apartments, small pocketbooks, better than the alternative, nothing at all. Gets better and better. And by the late 60s, RCA's consumer electronics business completely vaporizes as Sony has gotten good enough and people rapidly are migrating to this more affordable, more durable, by the way, technology. And, it's punishing, right? Because RCA spent way more money than Sony ever did perfecting the transistor. They saw it before Sony did, way before. And yet Sony won the day and RCA did not. And that's really what this is about, right? Like they invested in it thinking it would sustain their existing business model, as opposed to viewing it as something disruptive, which therefore requires its own model.
Regarding the move to a student-centric learning model, the great Buckminster Fuller said, all progress happens in the outlaw area. And you say here, so think of that company like RCA, it's got a proven model that works. They're successful, they're investing in R&D, but it's in the paradigm of sustaining the innovation that exists. And you say, in some of the earliest applications of student-centric learning, it will arise outside the public schooling system. The adoption decisions in this stage will be dispersed. They will be made principal by principal, teacher by teacher, parent by parent, student by student, and subject by subject. I love that quote because this idea that it's like the William Gibson quote that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And we can take advantage of that in organizations. So we're not the next RCA.
Yeah, 100%. And you can start to see the pattern, right, over time and realize that when students are opting for tutoring through online technology, or they're going into an out-school class, or Khan Academy has grown to 100 million users worldwide, or ABC Mouse Age of Learning is 50 million users worldwide, or Byju's in India is, I can't remember the valuation, but like 20 billion or something like that, right? That people are one by one making the decisions to move to alternative ways of getting a tutor, of getting their primary learning in some cases, and so forth. And that is piece by piece this happening, I think. And the system is doing it too. And by the way, they figured out ways, to the argument in chapter 2 of the book that more so than any other organization, schools have managed to negotiate these adaptations in really interesting ways. I would argue there's many classrooms that have crammed, the computers into their existing classrooms and yet have figured out ways to personalize more, whether they're creating simple station rotations. One of my favorites is Lexia Learning. I think it's a phenomenal way to learn reading that doesn't require everyone moving lockstep. It's not all the way to these mastery-based progressions that we were talking about in the last session with Steve Spear and the Toyota versus Chrysler model, but it steps forward. And yet perhaps the biggest leapfrogs are completely and entirely outside the purview of the system.
I wanted to build a bit on cramming because I think some of the language you give us for disruptive innovation through this book as well is fantastically done. One of them was this idea of, we often use the term lipstick on a pig, or as Seth Godin, as he wrote in his book, a meatball sundae. So it's still a basic thing, but you sprinkle on some toppings and some cream and all of a sudden, ta-da, it's digital. Or I call this concept the Suez Canal effect after the big disaster that we had. So the platform needs to be changed, not the tools that are on the platform. So the ships are increasingly big, but the platform can't take it. And this is an effect that's happening throughout the education system.
100%. And it goes to another piece of this, which is that really it's not just one innovation that disrupts the paradigm. It's a whole ecosystem or value chain that disruptively over time replaces another one. So by illustration, let's stay with that RCA being disrupted by Sony story. RCA existed in a business ecosystem, right? Of its customers, suppliers of its product, and it sold not direct, but through appliance stores, which made their money by essentially replacing the blown out vacuum tubes that happened every once in a while. So their money was actually made in repair. Okay, along comes Sony with this transistor powered product, and all of a sudden, these appliance stores can't make money by selling it because transistors don't blow out. So there's no repair, there's no aftermarket where they historically made their money and their margins. So they say, sorry, we don't have any use for this. And it's different customers, right? As we talked about in the story. Fortunately for Sony, in 1962 gets birthed Target, Walmart, and Kmart, all in the same year. And this is, discount retail, no ability to service things in the aftermarket with a product that doesn't need servicing in the aftermarket. And it's so simple that, again, teenagers and others can figure out how to buy them and so forth. And so this whole value chain over time disruptively replaces the appliance stores and the RCA powered consumer electronics and the supply chain and so forth. And that's how we typically see this work, is it's a system disrupting a system. Same thing happened in computers, by the way, right? IBM used to do all the sales for their mainframes in the personal computers. It was through CompUSA. And then Dell does it direct, right, through its website over time. We see this over and over again where it's really a system disrupts a system. And so that's an important, I think, thing to keep in mind in both the education context. It's frustrating because it means the progress is going to be super slow. But this is really ultimately system change we're talking about. It just turns out typically you don't change systems by reconfiguring everything inside. They do get replaced over time by the new.
Yeah, and it reminds me so much of evolution. Like, I mean, it's there's evolutionary pressure, like you talked about. There's extrinsic pressure that forces the evolution. But one of the ones I loved that you talk about is many people who work in Salesforce listen to this show, and Salesforce has an ecosystem where people can build applications. You then liken that, and bear in mind that the book was 10 years old. You wrote this 10 years ago when that was in its infancy, and you predicted that the same thing would happen in education software.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Our sense was that ultimately you'd have a facilitated network, right, where the organization at the middle, and we didn't have the language, by the way, of platform or aggregator, to use a Ben Thompson term, right, today, which are two different things. And I think it'd be interesting to think about both in education as a future application. But ultimately, this facilitated network where there would be people creating things for the network and people consuming things from the network. And, this is eBay, this is Facebook. There's lots of good examples of how this plays out. Salesforce is a vibrant ecosystem of applications and then business consumers largely, right, who are able to customize, in effect, the instantiation of Salesforce for their particular business case and needs and so forth, which is tremendous. And so as a result of that, you see Salesforce doing amazing things in education, let alone all the business applications where it got its start, because of that customizability and ability to build into the platform. And I think the same thing, if we're going to truly reach all learners, I think it's very unlikely there's going to be a silver bullet technology that somehow magically figures out how to serve each learner with all the different examples and historical relevant analogies and whatever else you need, because you and I have dramatically different background knowledge and so forth from our youth and growing up. And you just think about this long tail of learners, what that means from a knowledge perspective and scaffolding instruction. And so it's much more likely, I think, individual teachers, individual parents, individual students will build these modules in a variety of ways that will snap together to create coherence, and standards, I think, will be a backbone of that for sure. But the content itself, I think, could be widely ranging if we think of this as a facilitated network in the future. And I'll say, the book first came out, I guess, 2008, and then we revised it 2010. And it felt like, I still wonder, could Khan Academy or something like that be that in the future? It hasn't been architected that way to this point, but it's a question. And then I talk to CTOs at big companies, and they're like, "Oh gosh, I wish corporate learning were like K-12 learning." And I'm like, "How do you mean?" And they're like, "Well, I get all these complicated packages and whatever else to stay up to, to learn the latest language or programming thing or whatever. Whereas my kid, they don't understand something. They just jump on YouTube." And so I kind of wonder, has YouTube already become that place with this marketplace of content and so forth. And, maybe that's then what Udemy and others of these that have become big really are, is that facilitated network that we described. And it's materialized, at least in video, in the first instantiation. And I wonder, will we start to see more intricate simulations and different ways of architecting these experiences in the next generation?
One of the things that has come up on the show a few times is, screen time is not good for kids. And you kind of go, well, not all screen time is created equal. It depends on what they're doing. And we had Bob Johansson from Institute of the Future on the show before, talking about his book, Full Spectrum Thinking. And he said, a lot of these companies who are software companies now are building data visualization tools for the future. So they're using their existing knowledge of software and beautiful exhibits of the creative output of the animations, etc. But I thought about how interesting that would be for kids who are already very familiar with the platforms. What are you seeing in that space?
We think nothing of FaceTiming with grandma because it's an interactive experience, right? So that's at the low level of what you just implied, where it can go all the way up to creating videos and CAD software and all sorts of, fun mashups, and all of Scratch, right, is basically object-oriented computer programming, which is phenomenal. It allows so many people to get understandings of how you build something and construct and basic logic and computational thinking models without perhaps having all the background knowledge on a specific language of word-based coding, right? And so I think we're seeing a lot of very cool applications for kids increasingly doing that, and realizing, hey, for the really young learners, even better if you can engage mom and dad. Now, there's a continuum on that, right? Because sometimes mom and dad use the technology to give themselves an hour break to get dinner on the table. I'm guilty of that every single afternoon with my kids. I pick them up, and then Tuesday through Thursday, they say, I want to hop on the Kindle. Sure, go ahead. I need the hour to get dinner ready anyway. But, in that context, though, I'm way more excited when they pick something where they get to be snapping and editing film together or whatever else, than they're just going to sit there and watch an hour-long show, and they get up afterwards and they're groggy and so forth. So, look, there's a place for everything. I think passive TV is a wonderful thing in limited doses. But I think that's sort of it with technology more generally, which is moderation and everything. Yeah, your kids, we talked about our health love. They should be outside getting vitamin D and running around and so forth. And technology is really good at building some background knowledge and giving them some active learning experiences that they would never otherwise get. Like my kids, they bring up concepts. The other day we were ordering from a Cuban restaurant. My youngest daughter, 7, says, oh, we should get these dishes. And I'm like, I don't know what that is. I see it on the menu. I'm like, what are they? She starts telling me the ingredients because she's seen it on her Kindle and learned about the Cuban culture. That's incredible. That doesn't happen, and someone, a cynic, might say, well, books and so forth. This is a kid having agency at their fingertips to be able to pull that information in a way that I can never provide. That's really neat.
That is so awesome, man. I love that. I have the same experiences, and I just think that's so beautiful when a kid tells you something and you're open to it and you listen to it and you learn from it. It's because it's different sources, like you say. But that point about us learning and, learning from the kids or whatever, I want to emphasize your work is the full spectrum of learning. You're a consultant in all realms of learning. Your other book, Blended, as well, is fantastic. There's a blended workbook. You also have a kids book as well that you wrote with your wife, and it's fantastic.
Yeah,
and I'll ask you about them at the end of the show. But I just wanted to get here in case we run out of time again, which is the idea of what your former colleague and friend Michelle Weiss had talked about, long life learning. So we're living longer. We probably won't retire at 65 much longer because the system can't really afford it. That's one thing. But also, we probably won't want to retire. We probably will want some type of, we'll probably get some type of purpose and meaning from our work. And I'd love your thoughts on that whole idea. Like Michelle and you talk about this whole idea of the more on and off ramps from education as you have to reinvent yourself for longer in life.
My current boss, Rachel Romer Carlson, the CEO of Guild Education, she loves to say, the 4 and 40 model is basically dead, and we're at an every 4 model where every 4 years, your technology stack, your knowledge stack, and so forth has eroded, and you need to consciously, particularly for a frontline employee these days, consciously upskill and reskill yourself. If you're in the digital world, you may be doing that on a very frequent basis where you're constantly pulling in new information almost through osmosis. Sometimes you may have to make time to say, I need a month to go deep on something, right? Or I need to take time off to go deep in a formal program, whatever it is. The point is that this need in a knowledge economy, with the pace of technological progress being what it is, to continually learn new skills and be able to apply them is going to be vital. And so we ultimately, I think a major purpose of K-12 education is to teach learners to have the agency, to be able to direct their learning in the future, to learn metacognition, how they learn best, and be able to curate their own learning journey by the end, so that when they go in the real world, they can also make those choices at whatever interval and sequences and so forth make sense for them, so that they are constantly investing in their learning to stay up with the changing world and be able to reach and realize whatever career ambitions and passions that they might have in the process, right? Part of this is about keeping up. Part of this is the world's changing and you're going to need to have new roles. And part of this is they are going to be super passionate about something and want to go achieve a dream and extend themselves in some meaningful way. And so our education and workforce systems being more and more open to a permeable boundary between them that makes it less hard to invest in education and less hard to then get back into the next step of work, I think is going to be absolutely imperative as we move forward.
Now, I have a final quote that I'm going to quote, but I'm going to ask you then about your final message for audience. Where can people find out? I mentioned those books you do. I mentioned how you do consulting and keynotes, etc. Where can people find you, and what other books do you have available?
Yeah, so the simplest way to find me, and I appreciate the question, is michaelbhorn.com. It's my personal website. I'm on Twitter at michaelbhorn. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, etc. And you can check out my Substack newsletter as well, The Future of Education, which you can get to through my website or just jump in on Substack directly. For the free subscribers, I send 2 newsletters a month. And then for those who pay, you're getting at least a weekly update on things that I'm writing and speaking about and so forth. So definitely those are the easiest ways to keep track of me. In terms of books, Disrupting Class obviously was the first blended, and then the blended workbook. There was also a book I edited called Private Enterprise in Public Education, which is about the role of for-profits in education, which is a very contentious space, but I think we made a very important contribution in reframing how to think about them in the education landscape. And then my latest on education was called Choosing College, which uses the jobs to be done methodology about why do students choose any form of post-secondary education. So that's corporate learning to MOOCs to formal colleges. And then, as you noted, we've got a book out called Goodnight Box, which is for younger children and their parents, perhaps most importantly, around introducing them to the CrossFit and functional fitness movements that are important to us and sort of what I'm working on in the future. My wife and I got to co-author that together, and we have a series of other children's books planned around some of the great role models that are in that CrossFit world, specifically for women, because that's, as the father of 2 daughters, that's become something more important to both of us. And then working on a new book right now called From Reopen to Reinvent, around how should K-12 reinvent itself coming out of COVID, and that it's not just enough to reopen and sort of go back to normal. We've really got to rethink a lot of these systems in the ways that we've been talking about over the last few days.
I have a final quote, Michael. I love this quote. There was so many, but I picked one. And then perhaps you'll leave us with your thoughts on forging a consensus for change and giving schools the right structure to innovate, and just a very quick overview of those thoughts. You say in the book, the road to realizing our highest hopes for our schools is not an easy one, but with breakthroughs occurring every day in understanding how children learn and how they build intellectual capacity, there is a great opportunity to make strides in the years ahead, provided we do so with an understanding of the root causes of why schools have struggled so much. If we embark upon the promising path we outline in this book, we can make schooling intrinsically motivating and help our children maximize their individual potential to realize their most daring dreams. I absolutely love that. That's my parting quote that I pulled from the book. But what about you? What's a message you have perhaps for those people out there, both in disruption and change in themselves and indeed in the education system?
So I guess I would say, and by the way, that was my favorite line of the book, I think, to write.
Good. We didn't plan that.
No, we didn't. I remember writing those words and this notion of your daring dreams and not seeing a floor, but instead imagining a ceiling for every child that is not there, that they can reach for the sky, is really, I think, important, right? School should lift the floor and it should lift the ceiling. It should do both. And so that was incredibly, I think, impactful. And the point there, right, of how do we recognize that all individuals are very motivated to feel successful and experience vibrant lives with others, and that they want lives of choice and meaning and so forth. And for some, the way school is set up today, it does work. But for the majority, it's not working. And so building within that, I think, and forging a path forward where people can say, hey, we may not agree on this food fight or that, but ultimately we want to allow each individual their best shot at their best life. I think we've really got to organize around that intrinsic motivation and making school fundamentally exciting. Because as we talked about in the early part of our past talk, a lot of that extrinsic motivation is not there anymore. And so you've really got to weave in with what the latest evidence from the science of learning and make these schools something that someone can hire to be successful.
Brilliant book. I highly recommend it for people not even in the education field. It's such a brilliant way to learn about innovation. Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the World Learns. The co-author of that book and future guest of the show, Michael, you're in now, man. I have to bring you back to talk about that new book in particular. Michael B. Horn, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me and for hosting a really in-depth set of insights and conversations. I appreciate it.